Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I'm back with another section of Holbrook Jackson's The Anatomy of Bibliomania, and I wanted to read to you a section on a digression of reading aloud. Now, I like to read aloud, and I often film a video just reading aloud just for the pleasure of it. And I sort of wish that we could go back to the days when reading aloud was an acceptable thing to do when you have a group of friends over for a party. I was always enamored by that scene in Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett and India and Melanie are passing the evening away while the men are at the so-called political meeting, and one of them is reading aloud from, I think it's David Copperfield. And I always just love that scene and thought how wonderful it would be if friends got together and spent an evening like that. Of course, with the invention of radio and TV, and now, of course, the internet, people just don't do that because there are many other entertainment options. But I guess here on BookTube, we do get a chance to sort of go back to that sort of entertainment, even if we're not in the room together, and even if we're not, sitting and spending an evening that way. It is sort of a chance to commune over the act of reading aloud. And of course there are audiobooks, but audiobooks just feel different. Audiobooks are a performance, they're a way to consume a book. It's less of a chance to sort of commune over a work of literature. And so I'm not going to read you the entire section on reading aloud, but I'm going to start here where Jackson is talking about Shelley. So he says here, Shelley read the whole of English bards and Scotch reviewers and all the notes with fervid and exulting energy to Hogg in the country outside London, whither they had walked after buying the book, then newly published at a bookseller's in Oxford Street. Swinburne and Meredith enjoyed Fitzgerald's Omar for the first time, lying together on a heathery knoll on Box Hill in Surrey, reading a stanza alternately, indifferent to the dinner bell, until a prolonged summons reminded them of appetite. Nor are companions or any human audience always necessary, for there is a joy in reading aloud for one's own ears, or for the benefit of those natural objects which are as near and often as dear to us as our own kind, as when the youthful Heine in the palace garden of Dusseldorf, still unpractised in reading, pronounced every word of his favorite Don Quixote aloud, so that birds and trees, streams and flowers were able to hear everything. Or, more fantastically, when Luke Bird would go off of a summer's evening to a little mound that in May was always covered with cowslips, with William Law's serious call to a devout and holy life for company. Mr. Mumby's herd of cows would feed about him, says my authority, and sometimes a gentle beast would wander near to him and gaze at him with eyes of affection, and Luke would open his book and inform the creature what heaven was like, and read to it aloud a few pages in a mild manner. Shelley read aloud on all occasions, with or without audience. Gerber was an early obsession. He would read aloud, or to himself sometimes, with a tiresome pertinacity which once so enraged Hogg that he snatched the book from him and threw it out of the window. Yet, in the face of all this evidence of delight, there are some few who would have it that books are not written to be read aloud. This was asserted by Theophile Gautier, but they need not delay our argument, as so many writers of books refute them by their practice, delighting not only to read their own works, but those of others to any willing listeners. Reading aloud needs no defense. There are some even who hold it to be the best way to explore the inwardness of certain works in theology and poetry. Prophet Duran advised Jewish students in the Middle Ages to read with both eye and ear. Read aloud, he said. Do not work in silent pouring. And there are living authorities who would have us catch the rhythm of poetry by the same practice. The Greek for reading means, Lang reminds us, reading aloud. Homer was read in public places by the rhapsodists who wore a blue gown when they recited the Odyssey and a red one for the Iliad. The Romans so valued the method that their literary works were first read aloud with a view to selling them, and readings were a recognized form of entertainment at many Greek and Roman feasts. It is not required of me that I should do more than name the reading of scriptures and other pious works, which is common to all religions, both in public and private, for these exercises of the art, whether enjoyable or not, are ceremonial rather than indulgent. Pliny made reading aloud one of the regular means of entertaining his guests, on whom he often tried his own works. On one occasion he thus read for 2 days successively, and he held that to be so confident of your friend's affection that you feel no dread of wearying them is a sure indication of your own. In the ancient monastery, says Meriwether, books were read aloud to the brothers at meal times, or to the whole community when otherwise met together, and by this means a genuine communalization of literature was accomplished. Sir Thomas More introduced the custom into his own home at Chelsea. He used to have one read daily at his table, which being ended, he would ask of some of them how they understood such and such a place, and so there grew a friendly communication, recreating all men that were present with some jest or other. King Alfred the Great was read to by his secretaries at all times, day and night, whenever he had respite from other occupations. If more evidence from past time is demanded, read it in Rebus, where Granauzer orders Ponocrates to instruct his son Gerantua in a diversity of languages at all times of the day and during all functions. Thus was read unto him at 4 o'clock in the morning some chapters of the Holy Scripture, whilst they were rubbing of him. At dinner there was read some pleasant history of the warlike actions of former times, until he had taken a glass of wine. Then, if they thought good, they continued reading, or held discourse upon the virtue, propriety, efficacy, and nature of all things served at the table: bread, wine, water, salt, fleshes, fishes, fruits, herbs, roots, and of their dressing, substantiating their arguments with learned passages from Pliny, Athenaeus, Dioscorides, Helidorus, Aristotle, Aelian, and others. And in order to be more certain, they caused the books of these authors to be brought to the table. Then he betook himself to athletics, running, riding, bathing, tilting, etc., climbing up trees like a squirrel, and pulling down great boughs like another, Milo, running up and down a wall like a rat by the aid of 2 well-steeled daggers and 2 bodkins, casting the dart, throwing the bar, putting the stone, practicing the javelin, the boar spear, and the halbert, afterwards rubbing down supper, recapitulation of all he had heard read to him in the manner of the Pythagoreans, and so to bed, giving thanks to the Creator for his bounty, in which the praise of books and of reading aloud might properly have been included, of which, however, mine author says nothing. In modern times, the practice still has many devotees. Tennyson would entertain his friends by reading to them his own poems, particularly Maud, in the deep melodious thunder of his voice, rather murmuring than mouthing, like the sound of a far sea or a pine wood. On the 27th September 1855, he read his poem to a small party at the Brownings. Robert and Elizabeth were there, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who then made his famous sketch of a laureate as he read with book close to eyes. One of the pleasantest things which have happened to us here, Mrs. Browning tells Mrs. Mitford, is the coming down to us of the laureate from Freshwater. He dined with us, smoked with us, opened his heart to us, and the second bottle of port, and ended by reading Maud through from end to end, and going away at 2:30 in the morning. If I had a heart to spare, she confesses, certainly he would have mine. He is captivating with his frankness, confidingness, and unexampled naivety. Think of his stopping in Maud every now and then. There's a wonderful touch. That's very tender. How beautiful that is. Yes, and it was wonderful, tender, beautiful, and he read exquisitely in a voice like an organ, rather music than speech. Writers of books have ever indulged themselves by reading their manuscripts and printed works to select friends. Instances are innumerable, but I will do no more than cite 1 or 2, that of Thoreau reading parts of his newly written Week on the Concord to Emerson, seated under an oak on the river bank when the listener was invigorated by the new work. and that in which Blades went down to Cambridge to read his Life of Caxton to the university librarian Bradshaw. It was a fine, warm afternoon, and after dinner they dined together earlier in the days. They went down, as Bradshaw was fond of doing, to the college garden. A bottle of wine was ordered out, and there and then, without moving from the place, Mr. Blades read the whole of the historical portion of the book to his willing listener, who frequently interposed criticism and suggestions of the most useful kind. And I doubt not that writers enjoy, sometimes, hearing their own works read to them, as Dr. Johnson must have done on that occasion when his poem London was produced by Boswell during a jaunt to Greenwich, who read aloud with enthusiasm the lines on that favourite scene. Henry Crabb Robinson journeyed from London to Witham for the pleasure of reading The Excursion, then a new book, to Mrs. W. Pattison, to whom he also read the reviews of the poem in The Eclectic and the Edinburgh. Robert Southey counselled Grosvenor, Bedford, not only to buy Wordsworth lyrical ballads, but to read aloud the poems entitled The Brothers and Michael, presumably to himself, for so also may the true flavour of poems be tested. Charles Dickens, on the other hand, wore himself out reading his novels to vast audiences. He told Miss Hogarth, in a letter from Dublin, 25/8/1858, that everybody was at Little Dombey so great, the crowd that people had to be shaken into their seats. We could stay here a week with that one reading, and fill the place every night, but more like a theatrical performance this than a reading. Not so those quiet hours Dorothy Wordsworth devoted to reading to her brother, the poet, as on that occasion when he was tired out with working at his poem, The Pedlar. They made up a good fire after dinner, and William brought his mattress out and lay down upon the floor, and she read the Life of Ben Jonson to him, or Mrs. Boyle's reading of Tom Brown's School Days to Barbrina, Lady Grey, or Lady Louisa Stuart's reading Coleridge at Richmond to her family, or Ivanhoe. They are making me read Ivanhoe to them in the evening. In my mind, few books gain so much as those, in caning the Waverley novels, by being read aloud. Meaning the Waverley novels by being read aloud. And Miss Barry, Horace Walpole's friend, was equally happy reading aloud or being read to by others. She entertained her friends with such diverse works as Marian Gell's Ithaca and Mr. Fox's historical works, in the beautiful large paper copy which Robert Ferguson had given her. And Lord Roslin read Laura, Lord Byron's new tale, on 20 August 1814. And on an evening in the same year, she heard the poet Campbell read a discourse on English poetry at Madame de Staël's. Reading aloud in the old days was one of the methods by which the tedium of long winters was combated. Madame de Savin was never happier than when her son Charles helped to while away the long evenings at Les Rochers by reading aloud some comedy of Molière, or some pamphlet of Pascal's, or the latest books from Paris. Miss Catherine Talbot writes, from Cudessens, to her friend the learned Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, that they have happily fixed in a scheme of reading through all Sir Richard Steele's papers, which would last them as long as they stayed in the country. And although they were familiar with these works, this orderly and sociable way of reading gives novelty to them. They were read thus every day after breakfast and supper. 10 o'clock is the hour that generally concludes them at both those times. She read Dr. Young's Night Thoughts to her aunt. When Clarissa appeared, she and her family lived quite happily the whole time they were reading it. And by reading only en famille, they made the time last as long as they could, reading at set hours, and the rest of the day talking of it. Mrs. Hemans had the delightful talent of reading aloud well for the entertainment of her family circle, and she could continue this even as she walked. Mark Pattison records that his father, who read well and liked doing so, took Paradise Lost one winter for his family reading. Reading aloud was practiced in the family of the poet William Allingham, who remembers how his Aunt Mary Ann, a vivacious novel reader, would read the Waverley novels on a winter's evening at Ballyshannon. My grandmother in her armchair by the fire, with close cap, knitting incessantly, her snuff-box on a little table, an old cat called Norway snoozing on the hearth-rug, and sometimes jumping into her lap. Aunt Bess also knitting, grave and silent, and himself with paper and pencil, drawing and listening to the story at the same time. Sir John Herschel records how the blacksmith of a certain village would sit on his anvil of an evening reading Pamela to the villagers, and that when the happy turn of fortune arrived, which brings the hero and heroine together and sets them living long and happily according to the most approved rules, the congregation were so delighted as to raise a great shout, and procuring the church keys actually set the parish bells ringing. Friedrich Nietzsche would read to his sister and their intimate friends. Once he read scenes from Faust to a party of 12 friends on the summit of Mount Bray, above the lake of Lugano, while our eyes wandered over the magnificent spring landscape and grew intoxicated with the overflowing riches of the world. Henry Bradshaw was devoted to Tennyson during his Eton days, and when a new volume came out, he would take it home with him on his holidays and read it aloud to his sisters. And he liked to read Dickens to his friends at Cambridge. Edward Fitzgerald's sisters read Lyell's Geology to him of an evening when he was a young man, and when he was old and his sight growing dim, he would hire a village boy to read to him every evening, who stumbled at every third word and got tired so that he had to be renovated with cake and sweet wine. Another instance of youth reading to their elders is that of Archdeacon Groom, who, as a very small boy, read Gil Blas to the cook, Lewis Dowsing, and the sweetheart she never married, a strapping sergeant of the Guards who had fought at Waterloo. Tolstoy read aloud very well, and would often read something he had just written to his family, or something from the works of other writers. I could go on adding to my instances without augmenting my thesis that reading aloud is a proper practice, and on this account 'tis as clear and reasonable in itself as solitary and silent reading. And those that speak other things about it seem to me to talk at random and perfectly without book. There are no written laws for this gentle, sociable art, but some that are unwritten and proper to be observed, the most acceptable being that which draws us towards reading, which is unaffected and unposed. Choice of matter must also be considered, but here individual taste must remain the only reliable lawgiver. Charles Lamb gives out that some poets, Milton and Shakespeare for instance, demand reading aloud to yourself, or as it chances, to some single person listening. More than one, he adds, and it degenerates into an audience. But books of quick interest that hurry on for incidents, such as novels, even of the better sort, are for the eye to slide over, not the voice, and a newspaper read out loud is intolerable. Each one of his strictures could be hotly contested, and his tastes are opposed by many examples in this digression. I shall not add farther differences, for such problems settle themselves. But if the matter of choice is free, the manner is fixed. It will be unadorned by any pose or pretense. In reading aloud, you are greatly privileged, first to consort with all that is noble and beautiful in thought and imagination, and then to give it forth again. You adventure among masterpieces and spread the news of your discoveries. No news better worth the spreading. Few things better worth sharing, for its loveliness endureth forever. But you must read with reverence, for you are the interpreter of genius. You add your mind to his, your vision to his, your voice to his. You become spokesman for him, an intermediary. The art, said Dr. Johnson, is to read strong, though low. Let, therefore, no voice of brass, insolence of mind, or arrogance of heart cheapen or impede this traffic. Let your reading aloud be good talk, and shun elocution and histrionics as you would the plague. So I thought that was quite a fun section, and my tripod has slipped again. As I said, I'm going to need to fix that, but I hope you enjoyed this passage here, and I'll see you all again soon.